transitional programs that we could build within our current circumstances and our nation states, but also create international solidarity, a real international solidarity across borders. And I think this was something that was so important that, and very few of us in the movement really think that strategically in that way, and that you could mobilize and educate the working class to understand, and the socialist movement to understand and build unity across class within our nations and across the borders. And he identified particularly a couple of things which I really think are crucial, that we needed to understand and create programmatic demands around to build movements. And particularly, he identified the nationalization of banks. And anybody who's read Marx and the history of the period will know that, for instance, in the Paris Commune, that was what Marx said that the communards must do. And he tried to educate them around that issue, that if they didn't acquire control over the banks, they were going to be defeated. They were defeated, which he knew they would be. But that, of course, didn't make him stop being in complete solidarity with them, and spent quite a lot dealing with the issues afterwards. But Leo particularly wrote on that and really tried to educate around that. And I think it's crucial that we also start to think about that ourselves. He also identified healthcare, food, ecology, and opening way to formulate new ways of living and producing ourselves. All of these are key and could be built upon. That's the thing about them that is wonderful. They are transitional programs that we really need to identify and understand the importance of, and start to insert in our thinking and work with each other and building a socialist movement. So I say 2, 3 many Leos, and let's take this moment to grieve him and also solidarize with what his life and his comrades who were continuing in our own work, what he was really, really meant to us all around the world. So that's for the MEP. I say this for myself. I think also for those in the MEP who knew him, who worked with him and knew him. So I guess a moment of silence I need inside myself right now. Michael,
yes, thank you, Mary.
Yeah.
It's with sadness that I woke up today and found out that we don't have Leo Panich helping, but I do very much want to get started on today's very important talk. Marcello?
By the way, just me saying, Leo would want you to do exactly that. Leo is saying good, bravo, and he's applauding this work. So I just wanted to say that. Go ahead, Michael, I'm sorry.
So, hi everyone. My name is Michael Gardner. I am one of the people that helps keep the Marxist Education Project going, and all of you coming today help take us a few steps further. A few months ago, I saw that there were these books coming out, or were out already, one from Andy Merrifield, the other from Marcello Musto, who are both with us here today. And I took the chance and emailed to see if they would be interested in speaking with us. And like real fighters that they are, both responded in the affirmative right away. And I am so excited to be having Marcello come to talk about his last years of Karl Marx, a few weeks after Andy presented on Marx, Dead and Alive. Reading Capital in precarious times such as we are in right now. In addition, we have Bob Ware with us, who has an excellent volume on Marx's idea of emancipation and socialist goals. Bob will be visiting us in the spring to speak about that book. Marcello and Andy and Bob we really appreciate your coming. I don't want to take too much of my time because we have 3 people who have really taken some time, and we are here to hear them, not me. So I would like to turn the floor over to Marcello to talk to us about why he did this work on the last years of Karl Marx, what he discovered while doing it, And I'm giving the floor over to Marcello right now to say what he is going to do. Welcome to all.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for the invitation and for your kind words at the beginning. I was also going to start by saying few words about Leo Penich, but it has been done so well before me that there is no need to add anything. I would like to thank my two discussants today. I have met Bob Ware in a 2010 at a conference. We haven't seen each other in person since a long time, but I've been following his work. He was in China. And it is also a very big pleasure for me to meet and discuss for the first time with Andy. So I'm not going to take too much time. Also, we want to give as much room as possible for debate, discussion. It's just, I think that there are a couple of people with the microphone on, and it will be very kind if they can make sure that the microphone is off so that I don't see their images and I don't feel the interruption. So we are living in times of crisis, and it is generally said that in times of crisis, you go back to classics. No, and Karl Marx is surely one classic, and it is not surprising that Marx has been at the center of a revival in the last years. What is interesting for me is that after the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, there has been a big return to the Marx, to the critique of political economy. And I believe that in the past years, in the last few years, there are, on the contrary, several interesting books about the return to Marx, like, you know, his political ideas, and not only the critique of capitalism, which is what I've been trying to do with this book, a book that has been written for hopefully a general audience and not only for a specialist. And this is why I try to contain the book in agreement with the publishing house within 2020 pages, 220 pages, 215 pages. So I am going to talk about, the title of the book is The Last Years of Karl Marx, an Intellectual Biography. So I'm going to focus on this. At least I'm going to give to my discussant a few ideas to debate later. But it will take me a little bit of time. It will take me a few minutes before I arrive to the last Marx, to the late Marx, however you want to call him, because I would like to discuss who Marx was before arriving in this period. My book has a subtitle that, you know, it's an intellectual biography. It's 1881, 1883. So Marx was not a man of fame in this when he died, but surely he was well known in you know, circles of labor movements, and also in some in a couple of European countries for references to newspapers. Last, of course, the translation of Capital at the time in French and Russian, beside the original German edition. But it is surely not the Marx that is a big statue a few decades after in many European countries, in particularly after Russian Revolution. And it is also different from the Marx, this is where I want to start, that I need to represent to you the Marx before this period, before his last years. In 1840s, Marx is exiled. As many of you know, Marx had been traveling and being exposed from one country to another, Germany, France, Belgium, and then once again France, with some travels in England, and then the revolution of 1848, and finally at the end of 49, Marx, followed by Engels later, is staying in England for the rest of his life. So I see a Marx exiled, also a migrant, if you want to say, right? And is starting to live in very poor conditions in the 50s, in the decades after. And this decade, the 50s, we see a Marx that is a completely isolated person. Like, he is in touch with very few people. He's living in Sod, one of the poorest districts of London at the time, and is really in touch with 5, 6, 7 comrades. So nothing more than this. Lassalle in Germany, of course, Engels in Manchester, and few people who were being close to him in London. He refused to stay in the circles of revolutionary from Switzerland, France, Germany, who went to London and tried to reorganize the revolution without studying about the reasons of the failures of the 48, 49. Then we have the 60s. We know everybody that 1864 is a key year for the beginning of the International. So in this period, Marx is gaining once again connections. And I would say after 1871, after the Paris Commune, also some popularity, visibility, as I mentioned before. Some of you might know that it was defined on a few newspapers, the Red Terror Doctor. So this period is important for me because, as I will say in a few minutes, there are many problems in most of the existing biographies of Marx, if not all of them, in underrepresenting what is happening after the Paris Commune, after 1771, so in the last 12 years of Marx's life. This problem is also related to another thing that I must mention, better mention this at the very beginning of my presentation. So the fact that Marx's writings were, most of them, unfinished, many times uncompleted. And, you know, Marx in this period, so the Marx that we are seeing end of the 70s or the last years of his life, the topic of my book, is a Marx that has published this book in couple of books in the 40s, The Holy Families with Engels in 1845, The Polemic with Proudhon, Misery of Philosophy in 1847. It is true that the Communist Manifesto, again, co-written with Engels, was published in 1848, but there is actually almost no dissemination and barely something that could be called a real reception of this short but very important for us pamphlet before the middle of the 50s. It is actually, once again, of course, politics that is helping Marx ideas to circulate and Marx to gain popularity. And it is the text that Marx wrote in 1871, The Civil War in France, that is something that we can call sort of bestseller of Marx in this period, that is also helping later the circulation of Capital, although, of course, as you can imagine, that circulation is much more limited and problematic. All the many so-called books of Marx that we know were not books at all, and sometimes they were things that Marx wrote with no intention to publish them. I am thinking about, just to stay on the most known writings, the economic manuscript, the philosophical and economic manuscript of 1844, the German ideology, 45, 46, written with Engels, but actually the project was much bigger than that. I don't know, the very famous, well-known Grundrisse that were the first draft of Capital, not speaking of volume 2 and volume 3 of Capital or the theory of surplus values or many other short pieces that became very popular in the 20th century. Think, for example, the thesis of Feuerbach, this 2.5 pages. So I'm just trying to say that many times the Marx that has been read is a Marx of unpublished unfinished, fragmentary writings. And you can see this if you look at the philosophy, the most sold and famous texts of Marx are the 1844 manuscript. Or if you look at sociology, for example, still today you read in the textbook of sociology these pages from the German ideology on the division of labor. That is, of course, a very, very basic level 1 Marx. So with this introduction, I'm trying to say that all the biographers that in the 20th century have written about Marx's life, which means for us always intellectual biography, means always the making of his ideas, have always represented Marx as a man who was already dead in the 70s. I'm not even talking about 81, 83, the focus of this book, but already in the 70s. So if you look at very good biographies, they all stop in this period at the end of the First International, which ended for Marx and Engels in 1872. Actually, the International lasts for 4 more years in 2 different international. And they represent Marx as this decade as a period of slow agony. I'm just using the expression, quoting the words, or a period in which Marx's activities was limited to few articles. That's important for us to keep in mind. I'm going back to this in 3 minutes. Before this, I want to mention, on the contrary, the fact that the young Marx, that is what I sometimes call a sort of biggest invention of the history of Marxism. And by the way, I love the young Marx, so I do not belong to schools of Marxism that were, not interested about, the brilliant, beautiful pages of the 1844 manuscript, etc., Tusserien, etc. I mean, I have no time to go into this, but I just want to say that in this case, we also have non-published manuscripts, so non-published book. I mentioned the 2 of them, 3 of them, Thesis on Feuerbach, 1844 manuscript, German ideology. But these were books, these were texts that were turned into books and actually became extremely popular, in particular, of course, in the second part of the 20th century. Both things were published in Moscow in the early 30s, the manuscript of 44 and the German ideology. So there is this big debate about the young Marx. The young Marx is the only real Marx, is not the Marx the dogmatic Marx of Moscow, or the young Marx is not Marxism at all. Only after a certain point, Marx ideas can be conceived as scientific, as they said. But your attention should be focused on the fact that the entire debate is focused between 1844 and 1867. Many times, politics is left aside. So politics is not conceived as a way of learning for Marx and developing his ideas. And actually, I don't think so. And I've done a big study of the First International. And I think that Marx learned a lot also from his practical activity as a militant, as an activist. And there is nothing after 1867. So very little about what Marx tried to do after the publication of Capitalism. And this is also relevant for many things. I'm just mentioning one that is interesting for me, that is the idea of the communist society. The idea of communist society for Marx has been often represented with this very limited Hegelian formulations of 1844, of this manuscript, communism as dialectical things, or with the famous expression that today we know had nothing to do with Marx, was not written by Marx, and actually Marx was making fun of what Engels sketched. The idea included in the manuscript of the Germany ideology that communism means hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, and smoking the pipe and criticize philosophy after dinner. I have to enter now in the core of the presentation, and from now on, I'm just staying on the late Marx, but let's have these ideas in mind when we later discuss the points and the dissemination and the reception of Marx in the 20th century. So for me, the late Marx is truly the forgotten chapter, and it is a forgotten chapter not only in these intellectual biographies of Marx, and actually here I would like to open a problematic thing, that is the separation between theoretical works and intellectual biographies. Many, many times you have seen authors who have completely ignored Marx's life, even though Marx's life had a strong influence on his writings. And also you have seen most of the biographies not dealing with theories, with the development of the ideas. Of course, this is extremely complicated, and you understand why, right? I had the same problem when I have to put in 220 pages, only 2 years and a half, because Marx is so rich, so big, it's so complicated, it's so vast, it's so challenging for readers that writing a book that brings together intellectual biography and developments of ideas is extremely complicated. But having said that, there are many cases that can show us how this was really too extreme. For example, the perhaps most famous, and actually I know that the most sold and translated biography of Marx, the one that was written by Franz Mehring in 1918. Franz Mehring was one of the main intellectuals of the SPD, of the German Social Democracy, the same generation more or less of Ben Steinkowski. So Mehring is asking Rosa Luxemburg to write the chapter about Capital because he was not able, or he was not sure that he could overview correctly what Marx wrote about his masterpiece. So this is just an example of this separation. And this forgotten chapter, the late Marx, go back to what I was saying 1 minute ago. So why was the late Marx ignored? Not only these 3 years, 81, 83, but from many point of view, also the entire decade of the 70s. Well, first of all, because there were no published writings, as I mentioned before. So when you enter in a library and you go in front of classical collected works of Marx and Engels, like for example, the English edition, Marx Engels Collected Works, or the German edition, the Marx Engels Werke, you see that there is so much for some decades, including for the very important and relevant and voluminous journalistic work made by Marx for at least one entire decade. I'm thinking about the New York Tribune, 1851, 1862. Even though now we know today that Engels wrote 40% of those articles under the name of Marx, to let him write and think about the critique of political economy and try to move forward with Capital. But there is really very little about this period in these writings, in these collected works. There is actually the critique of Gotha program that Marx wrote in 1875. There are few other small political intervention, but there is no theory there. So many generations have ignored this because of this reason, and we can justify them. There is also one other reason, just to stay on the comparison between the so-called young Marx and this last Marx. There is the fact that the fortune of the young Marx was also related to, for example, some concepts. I'm making just one example, the theory of alienation, that was the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age in this period that I mentioned before, 1940s, 1950s. The manuscript was published in 32, but actually the real circulation just started when Nazism in Germany was not burning Marx writings, and when the end of World War II allowed European society to rethink about themselves. So alienation had the central meaning. You cannot find something similar in the manuscripts written by the late Marx that is responding in terms of need for theory. And also I must say that this manuscript, the manuscript that Marx wrote in the last decade of his life, I'm going to make a couple of examples later, they have all of them, almost all of them, a very high level of complexity. Not only conceptual complexity, but also textual complexity, because we have this, this genius, if we can use this expression for Marx, that is actually reading different books in different languages. Marx was able to read and was able to master 8 different languages. In 1869, 1870, he even started to read Russian, extremely important for our discussion today. And sometimes you read these papers and you see that there is 1 page in German, half a page in French, 5 lines in ancient Greek, half a page in Russian, and then many quotations in Latin, and then Dante, Italian, and then Cervantes, Spanish, or many other books. So it is extremely difficult to read this text, or if you want to put it that way, to edit, to translate this text. Or, as I also had an experience as a teacher, to assign this text to your students when you believe that they are very important, and then they might be very angry with you when you see them the week after, because they spend a terrible week trying to deal with all these complicated notes written by Marx. Conceptual complexity, because Marx is dealing with many things, doesn't exist. The political Marx, the Marx the philosopher, Marx the political economist, Marx the sociologist. Luckily for us, we come from a fantastic school of multidisciplinary and multi-dimensional, etc. Ideas developed by Marx. So I try to mention some reasons. I'm curious also to hear from my discussants. There are many other things that we can say. I don't want to take too much time, but I want to say that one reason, one thing is ignoring or forgetting this chapter, the last Marx, the last 10 years of his life, many decades ago, when there was no evidence for this, right? When it was extremely difficult to find these documents. You have to be a serious scholar traveling to Amsterdam, where 2/3 of Marx's manuscripts are kept and work there, which is the work that many people did. Like, for example, Lawrence Creder, who published the Anthropological Notebooks. The English title is not nice because actually those are ethnological notebooks. This is the title, but there is actually more anthropology. But either you do this, but not many people were, of course, able, also for the linguistic issues that I mentioned. So we can justify the generation before us, but ignoring this today, like many biographers of Marx keep doing, including, I don't know, recent biographies of Gareth Stedman Jones or Liebman, recently published by Verso, and many, many others. In this case, I would say that this is poor scholarship. and we can debate about this. So the fact that you see that there is almost nothing about what happened after 1872. And now I have to say something that is very relevant for me and goes to the introduction that I made, so to this idea of discovering the Marx, the political dimension and the political ideas of Marx as much as possible. So not only the critique of capitalism, not only the analysis of crisis, of the tendencies of great profit, all very relevant things, right? But in underestimating the last decades of Marx, we have also lost a lot of brilliant ideas, political ideas, most of the time that he had. When I say political, I also mean taken from history, from anthropology, etc. So my idea after reading this these documents, this manuscript, some of them not published yet, is that this forgotten Marx, the late Marx, is also the most useful for us today. So the most contemporary Marx. And this not only because we make justice to the real interpretation of what he thought. I'm thinking about all these opinions that say, you know, Marx is an Eurocentric, Marx is an economicist, Marx is only fixated with the conflict between capital and labor, there is nothing else, Marx is dogmatic, etc. So it's good to, you know, update the interpretation of an author. And this is something that can be done today, because between 1998, when the new Mega, the new historical critical edition in German, has restarted, sometimes the microphone on, please turn it off. There are so many new documents about Marx that I say that Marx is the classic whose profile has changed more in the last 2 decades, because it is not the only case, right, where we have new editions, new documents, new manuscripts, new notes of classicers of the 19th or of the 20th century. There is a lot about this new Marx that is coming out mostly in German, and then hopefully with translation in many other languages. So it is good to adjust the interpretation, to clarify some mistakes that are also, you know, political ideas very useful today to kick Marx out from, you know, university courses and representing Marx like a white male of the 19th century who was not even sympathizing for, you know, anti-colonialism and this kind of things, which is just not having any ideas of what people is talking about. But as I told you, this is also the most contemporary Marx, the most useful Marx for us today. Because in this period, I found many issues that Marx studied very carefully, and these issues were often ignored or most of the time not associated to Marx at all. I'm thinking about ecology. I'm thinking about the critique of nationalism. I'm thinking about migration, gender emancipation. I'm thinking about the collective ownership not controlled by the state. So other ideas, other possibilities for socialism. There is a lot there. And it is, in my opinion, the new generation of Marx scholars, so the generation that is, you know, starting now, that is working now in their late 20s, early 30s, or even myself, middle 40s, there is a lot to do there, and there will be many good books and ideas that will be using this Marx. Let's now return to the Marx of the 80s, which is, of course, in everything that I said so far. Just I start my book with a description of the Marx room, of his studio in Maitland Park Road in London. So in this period, Marx is trying to complete Capital. Capital is a very complicated things. You know, the state of the 3 volumes of Capital is, in a few words, in 30 seconds, the following. The first volume was published in 1867. There were many problems. Marx is changing many things. Actually, Marx was already changing the structure, the poor structure that he gave to the first edition while he was reading the drafts. And that's why he made an appendix that he added at the end of this edition. Marx helped the translation, started with the revision, but then in some points helped with the translation and even wrote new things with respect to the French translation that was published between 1872 and 1875. Then there was a second German edition. And then in this period, Marx is writing on the 3rd edition. So he's trying to find the strength to collect all the typos, mistakes, expanding as much as possible the first volume. So you can see that Marx is always trying to update his work, and this is the best things that we can use against this idea that you open Marx like in a religious book and you find the response to our problems in books, texts, or sometimes unpublished manuscripts that were not written to be published 150 years ago. There are also many unsolved theoretical problems in Capital. Volume 2, Marx is still working on this. There are a few drafts of some parts of Volume 2 in the 70s. And this is also why it was easier for Engels. Engels was able to publish this within a couple of years. The Volume 2 was published in 1885. And Volume 3 was extremely complicated. Thanks to the Mega Today, we saw that Engels actually intervened more than 5,000 times. Volume 3 was actually written in its entirety for whatever it was before the publication of Volume 1. So this belongs to the big manuscripts written between 1863 and 1865. This period was a very productive period for Marx, 61, 65, despite the beginning of his activity with the International, actually end of September 1864. I don't know if somebody is interested, we can talk about this, but there are these 4 reasons of Marx not being able to complete some of his projects. His misery, his health, his rigor, and also the scale of the work that he wanted to do. I have no time to talk about these 3, but perhaps I have 30 seconds to discuss about the scale, because this scale is related to what he's doing now and to the research that he's doing now in this period of his life. Late 70s, still early 80s, with the few energies that he had left. Because, life was extremely difficult for Marx in this period. He lost his wife. The end, he also lost his first daughter. So there are sporadic attempts made by Marx in order to complete Capital, move forward with Volume 2, or even publishing this, sending to Hamburg, to his publisher, this correction for the 3rd edition of Volume 1. And this question of the scale is an idea that I would say in a few words like this: the idea of expanding the study of capitalism, right? If Volume 1 was mostly focused on the blue books, for those who are not familiar with this expression, the blue books were the books published by the government in England, where you can see all the reports and all the statistics about the factories and the production in England. So Marx is trying to do what he did in Volume 1 with the blue books, but this time using statistics, documents, information from many other parts of the world. And actually, in a couple of chapters of my book, I try to explain, sometimes using Marx correspondence, some other times providing information that are, of public dominion just for the so-called mega arbiter, so for the editors of the mega volumes, that Marx is looking for these documents. Marx is asking to his comrades from United States or from Russia to send him this report so that he can study and he can expand and understand what capitalism is becoming, because for Marx it is not possible to write about capitalism if you don't understand what is happening to the developments in the United States, or the big changes that are shaking the Russian societies. After the end of serfdom, 1861, after the Civil War in the United States, 61, 65. So in this period, there are sporadic attempts. I'm talking about strictly, 77, 81, to, move forward with capital. But, and that's relevant for us, there are new research horizons. So if I mentioned before topics like, ecology, anti-colonialism, collective ownership, migration, etc. And now I want to talk about the horizons of Marx. So he is expanding his work, as I just said, on a global scale. He's paying much, much more attention to the South. He's studying carefully countries like Indonesia, Algeria. He's returning to India, but with a very bigger, larger, and deeper bibliography than the one that he had in the 50s. Marx basically studied history very, very carefully for twice in his life, in the 50s, late 50s, and late 70s. Sometimes at the microphone on, please turn it off. And Marx is also working on Mexico, so working on the impact of colonialism in these three areas I just mentioned, Maghreb, Central America, a little bit about South America, and the return to India. Marx is also studying for the first time new disciplines, anthropology, and is returning to ancient history, or perhaps, making some of his most important consideration about ancient history. In particular, is looking for the most likely sequence with which the different mode of production succeeded each other over time. So Marx is just checking his ideas in front of history, if you want to say like this. And this return to history, it is something that we find predominantly in this period, 1881, 1882. I provided some new suggestion for a correct datation of the so-called chronological extracts. So the anthropological notebooks, the chronological extract, these are the evidence of the fact that what I told you before is wrong, that Marx was dead, that there were a very limited intellectual activity, just a few articles, there was a slow agony, what I told you a few minutes ago. And now we actually see that Marx is not only continuing his research, but actually his research is expanding and is meeting new territories, is going in new territories and studying new, very interesting things. If I have a few more minutes, and I promise not more than 4, may I would like to discuss with you, I would like to mention, I would like to bring to our conversation, the fact that there is a very funny encounter between life and politics, between the intellectual, the theoretical interest of Marx and the political demands of this old man. He was not very old because he died at the age of almost 65, but he had a terrible life. And I told you before, misery and health issues played a very negative impact on him. So what is this connection? The connection is that at the same time that Marx is studying this ancient society anthropology and is going in these directions and is paying more attention to the what we call today global south, etc., he is receiving requests from these first Marxist groups that started to spread all over the world. And some of them, not only in Germany or in France, but also in not capitalistically developed countries, for example, Russia. So some of you have heard of this young woman, young but with already a significant biography of activism and political engagement on her shoulder. I'm talking about Vera Zasulich. And it is in the same period that Marx is studying ancient society, trying to understand, as I mentioned before, the most likely sequence of the modes of production, that Vera Zasulich is asking to Marx about the destiny of Russia, and in particular about the destiny of Obshchina, the rural commune. So the commune is destined to perish or can be socialist, skipping capitalism. So this is the big question, the question of life or death, if we want to quote the letter that Vera Zasulich is sending to Marx. And Marx is in this process of answering to Zasulich, also on the base of the study that it just accomplished, just finished, and thinking about in particularly is the famous book of Morgan, Ancient Society. But there is much, much more. And some of these notebooks, by the way, are not yet published in English, not translated into English. We are waiting this very good work that David Norman Smith, a sociologist at the University of Kansas, is doing, and Yale is publishing next year this new anthology of the late Marx, of some of the aspects of the late Marx, that is entitled Marx's World. And there are also many problems with the Mega 2, because the notebooks, the notes, the extracts of the last Marx, when I say extracts, I mean the fact that Marx used to copy some passages of the books that he read at the time, and sometimes also included these comments in favor or against in this extract. This is not published in full in the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, in the Mega 2. I don't want to open the discussion about Vera Zasulich, which is perhaps the only known things about this period of Marx's life. Probably my discussant will do it. I will learn from what they say. But I would like to say that Marx is changing his ideas about Russia, because Russia for Marx was always the place where the counter-revolution was finding support. Like if you read the Marx ideas about Russia from the 50s, Marx was always seeing Russian intervention as a negative one. On the contrary, in this period, on the base of this extraordinary thinker for Marx, that was Chernyshevsky. Chernyshevsky was one of the best, I would say the best thinker of Russian populism. This expression has nothing to do with the way we use populism today. Populism meant, anti-capitalism, left anti-capitalism, and Chernyshevsky was considered by Marx like a sort of new Engels. Like he was doing the work, analyzing the working class in Russia, a little bit like Engels. We celebrated his bicentenary a few weeks ago, did with his book, with the book that he published in 1845. So Marx is reading Chernyshevsky, is expanding his knowledge of Russia. Instead of finishing volume 2, and Engels and Marx family, they went crazy because Marx was receiving this pile of documents of Russia, and instead of finishing what he had ready, he was expanding and expanding more. But these ideas were very important to Marx, and in the end, Marx is thinking that it is possible to skip capitalism, and differently from all Russian Marxists said at the time, it was not necessary for Russian society to follow exactly the same steps, the same stages of England or of other European societies. Just in a few words, we can discuss about this later. But I want to say how relevant is this discussion for us, and how much compare there has been written, debated between Marx and Proudhon, Marx and Hegel, Marx and Bruno Bauer, and there is so little about Marx and Chernyshevsky. This is not a name that I'm giving you because I'm going crazy, it's Sunday, and I had a couple of glasses of wine before having this talk. Chernyshevsky is a real, relevant source for Marx, and he has learned a lot from him, and more in general is also observing with interest the political activism of the populist movement in Russia. So is Marx changing his ideas about capitalism? Is Marx converting himself at the end of his life into a new Herzen? Herzen was the friend and reference of Bakunin, so in favor of this primitive pre-capitalist form of communism? No, no, absolutely no. Marx has nothing to do with this. Capitalism is still a prerequisite for communism. I dedicated an entire section to explain this and to show this through all Marx's writings from the middle of the 40s until the early 80s. But the big question here is that for Marx, capitalism is not always a necessary transition, and Marx's ideas are not considered like, should not be considered like a sketch fatally imposed everywhere, or like the Marxists at the time said, capitalism as a universally obligatory stage. My time is over. I would like to tell you much, much more, but I would like to close by saying that in these last manuscripts and documents and research of Marx, we have not only a lot to learn in terms of the things that I mentioned before, new dimensions, new fields, but also there is a Marx that is extremely careful, and this is something that we should make justice of the interpretation of Marx, extremely careful to do not use interpretative categories that are, I don't know, good for European society to understand Middle Age, etc. Marx is even criticizing Kowalewski, is even criticizing the people that he liked a lot. Do not use these categories to understand, to try to explain different societies, societies like India, like Russia. And this is also useful for us, I would say, in particular for the young generation, like seeing somebody who is always hungry for learning and from reading more, and that is always connecting his studies with political intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcello. Very, very good. And don't worry about having spoken too much, because you gave us a great introduction to this very important book that we have available to everyone in the MEP bookstore. I'm not going to go on about that now because Andy and Bob are about to make their comments. But if you go to marxedproject.org, Marcello's book is available, as well as Andy's, and soon we will have Bob's after his talk in the spring. But we did not go over sequence. I don't know if we go now to Andy or Bob. We all came in at different times. I'm just going to go right to Bob. You're next to Marcello on my Zoom screen. So I am unmuting you, and then Andy, right after Bob, will unmute you.
Okay, I'm glad to come next because this is a wonderful book. There's much to learn and much to ponder here. Marcello has written an intellectual biography of Karl Marx's last few years, a biography of the intellectual thinking of that powerful 19th century genius. In looking at intellectual biographies, I'm thinking of some ideas that came to me as Marcello was talking too. An intellectual biography often gives us one idea after another, more developed idea, and then some other ideas that develop further. I see what Marx was doing as solidifying his old core, developing and enriching what he always thought, and Marcello has helped with that. The last century of Marx scholarship is an embarrassment for surprisingly and irresponsibly ignoring Marx's last years, apparently because Marx in his final years was thought to have been intellectually inactive, diverted by illness in the family, incapable because of his own weaknesses, etc. Or more realistically, because Marx scholars did not read what he wrote. Marcello has come upon a lot of new literature that has very recently become available, but he also uses lots of material that has long been available to all of us. Marcello tells us much about Marx's ideas and thinking in this period. There's plentiful information and revelations about so much that Marx was thinking. His book is a valuable resource about Marx and his thinking in the early 1880s. But we also learn in the course of this study more about Marx's earlier and most read work. I'm emphasizing, as does Marcello, the importance of looking at the thinking rather than the thought that might have been put forward, that there was a way in which he was thinking. A very good way of knowing how one is thinking is to see how they react to the books that they are reading. And in Marx's case, fortunately, he wrote a lot of marginalia, and we can find out about those reactions. We also find out a lot about what someone is thinking and how they're thinking by their conversations in correspondence.
Yeah. If you're gonna go running, there's a lot of people out there without masks. Lots. This is probably not the day to run, Ron.
Really?
Uh-huh.
So
We just a whole slew. I've never seen so many people without masks. The fuck?
Ron, can you turn off your microphone, please? Ron,
what's happening?
hold on, thanks.
And now we're all ready again. So we find out from correspondence, and as Andy has pointed out, Marcello has used the correspondence so superbly. We should be able to find out from other aspects of someone's life, like I wish we could know what Marx and Engels talked about in that 24 hours or close to 24 hours that Marcello talks about towards the end of Marx's life, when they end up drinking rum until about 2 in the morning. We know a lot more about what Marx was thinking and what the core ideas were. But I have 2 points to make about Marcello's book. The first is that it's written with clarity of ideas and elegance of presentation, which also speaks well of his translator, Patrick Camillier. Here's an example from early on. In Marcello's words, the dogmatic reduction of Marx's quintessentially critical theory resulted in the unlikeliest paradoxes, including the convinced believer in the abolition of the state was built up into its firmest bulwark, and also envisaging the free development of individuality, Marx was falsely associated with a conception that erased the richness of collective decision. This is a nicely put discussion of the corruptions of Marx. Another passage says, Marcello writes, anyway, the critical spirit with which Marx composed his Capital reveals just how distant he was from the dogmatic author that many presented to the world. This is so important to emphasize. And finally, towards the very end, Marcello writes, those who look through Marx's writings today cannot but be fascinated by the capacity of his socio-economic analyses to explain the world, nor can they fail to be impressed by the message that radiates incessantly from the whole of his work, organize the struggle. I want to emphasize the continuity of this core of the socioeconomic analyses of what Marx was doing. My first point is that the book teems with eloquent and important observations. My second point is that Marcello's book has important revelations about Marx's socioeconomic analyses from his last years back to his early years. It must be noted that Marcello's book is not so much about what Marx thought, but about how he thought about societies and their changes. Marcello does not depict a methodology or schema or system. He persuasively argues against attempts to do that, showing that they were alien to Marx. And he does this about a period of Marx's intellectual life that most commentators have regarded as inactive, feeble, or both. We learn a lot about Russia in the late 19th century in this book and about what Russian socialists were then thinking. Some of that thinking was misled by what became canonical and allegedly Marxist thinking about Marx's materialist conception of history. The canonical so-called theory came from the overused, not by Marx nor Engels, but by others, the guiding thread that Marx mentioned in Reflections on his work. The guiding thread was a schema of progressive epochs or stages with their distinctive structures of the base, the relations, and politics. Marx was explicit about the 5 stages in this guiding thread: Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois capitalism, and then communism. Well, he was also clear about the structure, especially of bourgeois capitalist societies. Marx regarded himself as engaging in a scientific analysis of Europe, and especially England up to the mid-19th century. He didn't always say, but he was frequently explicit that he was writing about Europe and not producing a system that would apply to all history and all societies. This is often noted, but not then used or attended to. What has seemed true is that he regarded his investigations as scientific analyses of the material conditions of human societies. That was the only way society should be investigated. There could well be more discussion about this, but these are Marx's words, I think, and what Marx continually did. This is a point about which Marcello's work is especially important. In my view, Marcello makes it clear that Marx's work in his last years was a further scientific investigation using his materialist conception of history. As Marx said in 1881, Marcello quotes this, Scientific insight into the inevitable disintegration of the prevailing social order is sufficient guarantee that the moment a truly proletarian revolution breaks out, the conditions will also be there. This is when Marx was looking at the literature on Russia as one of his scientific investigations. This wasn't a shift to something. He didn't tell us that he was doing something new now, something like anthropology or journalism or simply reading. Throughout his life, he pursued scientific studies with his materialist conception of history. His interest in scientific studies of society led naturally to his constant investigations of other sciences as well, from chemistry to biology and many others. Why would he look at other sciences except he was interested in science and what he was doing himself? This is another lesson from Marcello's study of Marx's work in his final years. There weren't changes in Marx's work, in my view. I think Marcello might bend in that direction a little more than I would. There weren't changes in his work, except for the change of application to other societies using the same materialist conception of history, the core of what Marx was thinking. This was science as Marx conceived it. There were those who agreed about this account of Marx and who then supposed a small change in the canonical theory with its path of history in 5 stages was the right one to follow. There are at least 3 kinds of change in that theory that we must keep in mind. One change, often considered, is that the final stage of capitalism could be greatly speeded up, shortened, and thus less damaging. This was probably Lenin's view about Russia. Russia's early phases of capitalism, in Lenin's view, could be speeded up to late capitalism and then early socialism. Another change has been contemplated in the guiding thread is that a whole stage could be passed over and thus totally avoided. This might be thought of as a Maoist position about China jumping from agricultural feudalism to early socialism, avoiding altogether the intervening stage of capitalism. Stages can be speeded up or completely eliminated. But there is also a third change that can be contemplated, which is a change in the very path itself. It strikes me, with Marcello's help, that this was something that Marx contemplated. Some societies, Marx thought, may take the different path from collectivist economies, as in Russia, to modern collectivist production on a large scale. The question from Zachulich that prompted in 1881, that prompted this thinking, engaged Marx in a variety of thoughts worked on in the several drafts of a letter, as Marcello relates in detail. A letter of reply, that is, in several drafts. Marx considered the possibility of a society with people's communes, the Obskina, moving to a society with socialist or communist structures. Such possibilities would clearly depend as well on the people's relations and ideas. The very concepts of class association and struggle would probably have to be adjusted to the times and conditions. This would be true of any core theory that I'm suggesting Marx, of the sort that Marx had. Russia wouldn't advance in the image of England in the way that Marx seemed to have thought that Germany would. This is a richer materialist conception of history in a way that is true to 19th century, as well as modern scientific ways, not using Hegel's or other philosophers' schemas, but instead collecting data and developing ideas. There may be some inevitability, but not rigid thinking. If I have any criticism of what Marcello has written, it is only a bit of chiding that he is too cautious in saying out front that Marx was the source of the Marxism engaged in scientific historical materialism. Could this be the way Marx was thinking in the 1880s and throughout his life? Marcello shows that it might well be. It is not too far-fetched to see how this would also be very relevant to being a Marxist in the 21st century. It calls for close examination of different structures than those in Marx's time and different ways for people to organize the struggle. People say, for example, that the past is another country. We have Marcello to thank for his insights about Marx. Thank you, Marcello. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. I am not going to waste any of our few minutes going on too much, but I will hold up both books, Andy's and Marcello's. They are both available. Many of you here are already reading Andy's book or were at that event. So now, Andy, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you, Marcello, for your presentation, which was very stimulating. I have to say that I love the book. I suppose initially I was a little skeptical about the project. So it took me a little while to pick the book up and to get moving with it. But before I even opened it, I was completely struck by this image, the last image of Marx, which I think was taken in 1882 when he was in Algeria. And this would have been after the death of Jenny, his wife, a few months after. And when you first look at it, you see this guy who's not much older than I am right now. And so more or less your age, I would say, Michael, perhaps. But he looks like a really old guy that has aged tremendously, given that he had such a hard life, given that his life was full of so much deprivation and misery and deaths of kids and squalor and disappointment with revolutions and having to live through crises and having to, be evicted from crappy accommodation, having to deal with the English weather, which I can completely sympathize with, having to deal with English Philistinism, which again, I can completely deal with, having to deal with English fish-bloodedness, to use another one of his words, which I can completely agree with. But actually, if you get rid of the beard and you just look at those eyes, they're eyes of a young man. They're still burning, they're still twinkling, they're still actually very kindly in terms of how they look. And I think that one of the things that struck me about your book, Marcello, which I wasn't really expecting, was just how moving it was and how touching it was and how wonderfully intimate it was in the way in which you were talking about Marx's life in Maitland Park in Kentish Town toward the end of his life, just how much of a dedicated family man he was, and just how much he loved kids, the epithet old Nick, and how he'd go walking around London with candy in his pocket, ready to give out to the neighborhood kids, and the neighborhood kids loved him. And he just came across as just this incredibly nice, non-dogmatic, elderly gent who was just like a grandfather figure who despite his suffering seemed to keep his good cheer. So I was sort of blown away by those very intimate discussions that you had of him. But what was also very impressive was just how you then managed to shift and to look at to quote Marx himself, to look at the macroscopic, that Marx was a microscopic family man, and he loved kids' noise. And these are quotes I'm using from your book. But throughout that period of his isolation and his pending old age and his illnesses and his trying to dodge ill health by going around to warm countries, going to the Isle of Wight in the south of England, getting off to the south of France and going to Algeria and constantly sort of trying to fight off this bronchitis, this bronchial illness that he had. But never did he lose his good cheer and his strange kind of optimism that he and Engels both kept. I think Engels was much more of a brighter, cheerier character than Marx himself, and it's obvious that Engels kept Marx's spirit buoyant and alive, and kept him quite young, as also kept him in financially kept him. And I think that, you know, Marx was clearly quite embarrassed occasionally of Engels' patronage and how kindly he was with his money. But this idea of moving from intimacy from the microscopic into the macroscopic was something that was very well done, very deftly done. And I wonder whether you could say a bit more, and when you respond, when you come back, just a little bit more about how you went about your research, because one thing I was just super impressed by was just how you'd mined, particularly the Marx and Engels collective works, volume 46, I noted, which is that period of 1880, 83, and it's just basically these letters. And a lot of the letters between his daughters, with whom he was very close, with Jenny and Eleanor and Laura, and he worried about them a lot. And Laura obviously died, predeceased him a few months before his death with liver cancer, and how that scene when Eleanor has to go to the Isle of Wight to tell her father, old Moore, that his eldest daughter Jenny had just died. And that passage that you cite when Eleanor said, you know, she was traveling by the train knowing that she was giving her father his death sentence. And I just thought, geez, this is stirring, moving stuff. So I was just struck about how Marx was almost portrayed as this elderly man who never gave up hope, was constantly trying to probe the wider political climate, looking for opportunities, writing about world history, writing about this vast canvas. All the while he was doing it in isolation, in almost a quarantine. And I suppose I was just inspired by the idea that, you know, like most of us, we'd been locked up a lot. And Marx didn't really have any money. He didn't travel very far. I don't think he went around London very much. He would spend the afternoon going around to see his daughters and having conversations with them. So he didn't get out a lot physically, like a lot of us. But it's very clear that his mind was out there, thinking about the world, thinking about the struggle, thinking about possibilities. So in a sense, it gave me a lot of inspiration for somebody who's approaching his age, somebody who's felt isolation like a lot of us for quite a long time, but he's keeping up this idea of keeping in contact with his comrades, keeping in touch with the struggle, thinking about the possibilities of socialism, expanding his thought, constantly working himself over, you know, to actually better himself, teach himself Russian. I was very happy to see that you mentioned that he taught himself Russian, and his two favorite authors were Pushkin and Gogol, particularly after my conversations talking about Gogol a few weeks ago. I was glad to see the proof that he'd read Gogol. So that was very nice. What struck me about Marx at this period was just how much of an everyman he was. You know, he could have figured in Ulysses. You know, we could have, you know, if Leopold Bloom was 20 years older, we can imagine him with the same outlook and same mindset as Marx. You know, he was anti-nationalist. He was against all kinds of forms of chauvinism. He knew about the death of children, their own children, like Rudy, the child of Leopold Bloom. He knew about all forms of reactionary types of nationalism that were going on, and Bloom himself was very much a progressive internationalist, broad-minded internationalist in a world that was very narrow-minded. And all of that just struck me as being very inspiring and very well done in terms of how you move from the micro to the macro and the intimate to the global in not even in a paragraph, but even in different lines. So that was remarkably well done. So I would like to hear a little bit more about the physicality of you doing your research and mining all the Marx and Engels collected works, and how you began to sort of put it all together in a narrative. The second point, these are comments with leading maybe to a few questions. The second thing I would like to say is about just where that thought was leading, because you'd managed to dig up and to unearth lots and lots of material that I'd never seen before. I didn't know about this workers' questionnaire that Marx formulated in 1880, and I'm quite curious to know how many other people had heard of it. So I went on to the Marx online website, the Marx archives, Marxist.org, and they had this workers' questionnaire. So the 100 questions that Marx formulated that he was sending out to workers about their conditions and about their unionization and their organization and their working conditions. I thought there's 100 questions here that, my God, this is, just imagine if we sent this out today to people working at Foxconn or Walmart or Uber Eats or, you name it. What would they be saying about their working conditions? So the fact that even so late in his life as 1880, he was always thinking about the workers' struggles and about how perhaps the consciousness could be corrected and what kinds of workers were conscious and who wasn't. And this workers' questionnaire is I'd recommend people just to dig it out for themselves and just take a look at the questions that Marx has formulated. It was originally published in French, I think, in 1880, and it's still, if you look at the questions, it still stands up very, very solidly indeed. The other issue around about what he was doing was this theme about Russia. Now, Chernyshevsky is a character that I came across a long time ago, and I don't know whether anybody else will be familiar with Chernyshevsky, but Chernyshevsky was an anonymous character who cropped up in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And in the book Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky is talking about the Crystal Palace and forms of socialism, and this is Chernyshevsky. But Chernyshevsky himself spent most of his life, my understanding, was in prison, writing in prison. He was a bit like Blanqui. He wrote in prison. He wrote a novel which inspired Lenin, a novel called What Is to Be Done, which has a protagonist called Vera, I was quite struck by that letter of Marx writing to his Russian comrade Vera. And Vera was the protagonist of What Is to Be Done. And this is just trying to imagine what socialism might look like in the future in the shape of a dream. So Chernyshevsky was a guy who also wrote in solitary confinement, but he was always dreaming big. And it's nice to know that Marx actually rated Chernyshevsky and that he acknowledged him as this budding Engels. And it would have been interesting to know if ever the guys met. I don't know whether there's any way that might have been possible. But that was just one thing that struck me about Chernyshevsky. The other thing about Russia is, if we think about what Marx was suggesting here, whether he was formulating this idea of, did Russia have to go through this transitional phase? Did it have to somehow move through a form of industrial capitalism to come about socialism? So that just got me thinking about some of the alternative ideas about what socialism might have been in Russia, because Marx is reacting a little bit against his own thought that various countries, England was showing various countries the image of their own future, and whether in fact this transition had this evolutionary process whereby countries have to go through an industrial form of capitalism, or at least some form of modernization of their economy before they can begin to be mature enough to develop a form of socialism or communism. whether he was questioning that and developing his thoughts and thinking about the possible alternatives, which then raised in my mind a sort of what if the October Revolution, after the October Revolution, there wasn't any great collectivization of the land? What if there wasn't some 5-year plans that industrialized the economy in the way it did? What if it was a much more decentralized form of communal socialism that did in some way include a peasant base, a progressive peasant base, and it did include the kinds of things that maybe that Chernyshevsky was talking about? What kind of socialism might have emerged in the Soviet Union if it had been a little bit more decentralized, a little bit more empowering for the communes, a little bit more less, let's say, less vitriolic towards the underdeveloped countryside? If there were other ways of instigating a much more ecological, eco-friendly, decentralized form of communism. So that was just something that struck me, or what if? But the question that leads from that is that, well, maybe Marx was right in the first time round, that given what's happened now, is that maybe he was right that what we have now is a Russia that is trying to, is a developed form of capitalism. It's almost, it wants capital without capitalism. It's like China. And that is, perhaps Marx was right that it's still too early to tell even yet about Russia, that his interests in Russia were actually quite necessary for thinking about world socialism. Could we still see Russia as being a country that might actually end up having gone through this form of industrial capitalism, a form of modernization? Is there still hope that it still could one day be a kind of real communist society at some point? I don't know. It's just I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that, Marcelo, about the possibilities for some form of socialism that does follow Marx's logic in Volume 1 of Capital. And that also could be attributed to China as well. Could we see China now having leapfrog from agrarian peasant society to a form of communism? Now it's mightily trying to industrialize, and it's becoming more capitalistic almost than the United States, in terms of where it wants its economy to grow. Again, it wants capital without calling it capitalism, but it's clear that impulse is there, and we could almost argue ironically that revolution in Russia and revolution in China were the quickest route to actually develop advanced capitalism, ironically enough. So that is what struck me when I was reading your books about just what it might mean today for Russia and for China, and what Marx perhaps was hinting at in terms of what is necessary towards the passage to socialism. I'd be just interested to see if you could move your own argument along, if you could move late Marx along to put it into our time, and to see what this actually might mean now. The other final thing I want to say was just a couple of queries, really, almost nitpicking, because I did enjoy the book, and I was just curious on page 103, I think it is, when you mentioned that Marx wanted to go to Gibraltar, and he couldn't manage to get a trip to Gibraltar, which still does belong to Britain. I think at least its jurisdiction is still Britain, even though its running is a little bit more complicated than that. But apparently he needed a passport. And then in the next paragraph, he's off in France and down to Marseille and then out onward to Algiers. So I was just wondering, how was he able to do that without a passport? Because he was a guy without a nation. He was a citizenless person. He didn't have a passport. He was denied a passport. He tried to get British citizenship, but he was denied that as this, this foreign agitator. So I was just curious that, how did he manage to pull it off? How did he manage to make it to Algeria? And speaking of Algeria, and this is where I end, is that this incredible picture, which was a simulation of Marx, who did have a haircut in Algeria, and apparently he shaved his beard off, as you told us, which I never knew. And this is an artist's mock of the time, 1882, of what he may have looked like without his beard, which is kind of mind-blowing as far as I'm concerned, to think of Marx without his beard. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you for a very stimulating and engaging book.
Thank you, Andy. Marcello, after Bob and Andy, you will need 5-10 minutes or so. Marcello?
Yes, I'm here. I will try to take as little as possible so that we can also receive at least a few questions.
Yes.
Comments, criticism, of course, not only for me, but also for my two discussants. And also because they have made such a wonderful presentation, both of them. They have been extremely kind with me, and I thank both my old friend Bob and, if I may, my new friend Andy. And also, many of these things are contribution to the discussion in things that we could, deal with during a conference dedicated to some of these topics than in the Q&A. But I will try to say as much as possible, and then I'm sure that I will be in touch with my discussant by emails or for other clarifications. I was particularly, I am particularly grateful to Andy for the accent that he placed in his time in his presentation about the intimacy of this biography and Marx's life. Because when I was contacted by Michael, we were trying to balance these two elements, right? So we were looking for a theorist and also a biographer. And I already spoke before against this division. I think that both you and Bob have done this particularly well, and this was also the spirit of my work, and also one of the reasons perhaps you have been so kind with your comments with me. So I see a lot of what you and Bob said that is similar to the kind of approach that I had. And yes, and it's true that Marx had this passionate word, beside politics, or this small room of Maitland Park Road, right? It was a very small desk, used to write on a small desk. I tried to find as many information as possible, as you said. I wrote the book quite quickly, very quickly, but you surely understand that there are many, many years of passion for Marx and readings of Marx behind this work. And there are also many stories, many details. I own a clarification to Andy about this, but of course time is very limited. It is strange, but that society was not like our society today. So when Marx is in Marseille, he's worried about what is going to happen with this passport, with this thing. And then he wrote to Engels, that's fine, nobody asked me anything, I'm on the boat, that's it. On the contrary, if we would have gone to Gibraltar, then that would have been impossible. And of course, they were also trying to think which country was more difficult for control of the police. But Marx is coming back also to Germany on a couple of occasions. The most important one is when in 1867 is bringing the manuscript of Capital Volume 1 in Hamburg with himself, or when Marx is visiting what we call today, Czech Republic, and is going for this healthy summers at the end of the 70s in this spa city of Karlsbad. So Marx had to go through this. So it's a very different society compared to today. Andy and Bob both asked me about the use of the correspondence. I'm particularly glad about this, and I shared the comments that they had. I usually divide Marx writings in 5 categories, the things that he published, his published writings, his manuscript, the journalism, and the marginalia, the notebooks, and then correspondence, the letters. And at the time, letters were very relevant for Marx, for Engels, perhaps even more, because they were an essential, indispensable level of political education, of being in touch with many people in many European countries and giving them the information, updating them and explaining them, and also answering to their questions. So they did a lot. Engels in particular in this latest period. But what is useful for me is to read not only the letter written by Marx and Engels, but also the letters received, sent to Marx and Engels, which is something that we don't have in any editions, in English, in Italian, in Spanish, in the Marx Engels collected works. So this is a little bit the revolution of the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, that you can read all these letters. We are talking about 20,000 letters, more or less, received, sent by Marx and Engels. Of course, only a part of this were kept. And Marx and Engels wrote about 4,000 letters, themselves. So studying this, imagine reading, for example, the Revolution of 1848-49, or studying the First International with this material available, with this big volumes of letters, or studying Capital with all this manuscript. Of course, it changes, and it just take a few more years to write the book. But then when the book is out, should have something interesting to discuss with your colleagues or with your friends. And then there is this attempt that in this case, I also have to stop myself. So I'm sorry, I'm just talking about me as a researcher now, 30 seconds, but I've been asked, because I also went into newspapers, biographies of every person with whom Marx was in touch, and reading their own work or reading the literature that Marx was doing at the time. But then I also had the pressure of the publisher, of containing the volume of the book, right, and aiming to reach a bigger audience with this. The question is, of course, also expanded. This is Andy's second comment about also the materials that I used, that in some cases are new materials, in some other cases are old, forgotten materials. You mentioned the workers' questionnaire, but actually this workers' questionnaire, this is one obsession, if you want to say, that Marx already had at the time of the First International. I published an anthology in 2014 that is called Workers Unite. And if you see this, you will see that Marx had prepared questionnaires for the workers, and he wanted every section of the International to work on this, but they didn't do it. They didn't understand the priority of this, of sending this to the workers, making them speak. I say that actually the workers' questionnaire is sometimes not only a way of asking things, but also a way of putting ideas in the head of the working class. But it is particularly relevant for me. Allow me to read, I never do this, a few quotations from this other document that is called the Electoral Programs of the Socialist Workers' Party. Generally, we talk about the Communist Manifesto. But this document here that Marx wrote in 1880 is much more relevant from some point of view than the Communist Manifesto that was being considered by Marx and Engels already in the 60s, an historical document, as he said, right? So Marx is writing, the emancipation of the productive class is that of all human beings without distinction of sex and race. Marx is writing, legal prohibition of bosses employing foreign workers at the wage less than of French workers and equal pay for equal work for workers of both sexes. You see here something that, as Bob told us, means a progression in Marx's idea. And if I may, Bob, I agree with you, a progression that also came from politics. I mentioned this, right? Not only from the books, not only in the British library, not only as an intellectual reading these documents. And allow me also to read something else about Chernyshevsky, because actually the extremely relevant consideration made by Bob are also integrating the intellectual curiosity presented by Andy. And by the way, Andy, I can say, yes, Chernyshevsky and Marx, they met. Never in person, because Chernyshevsky was in Siberia. And actually, because of Chernyshevsky, Marx went into trouble, because the first translator of Capital in Russian, Lopatin, started to translate the book, but then stopped the translation after a few chapters because he wanted to liberate Chernyshevsky. Went to Russia. He was not able to do it, but he tried. And then it entered the generation of Danielson and of the other translators. So there is a meeting of the two from this point of view. But look what Chernyshevsky is writing. I'm reading from them. Is a book that Marx loved very much. Chernyshevsky had asked whether a given social phenomenon has to pass through all the logical moment in the real life of every society. And as Bob Ware has told us, his answer had been negative. Chernyshevsky is writing, when a social phenomenon that reaches a high level of development in one nation, is progression to that stage in another, more backward nation, may occur rather more quickly than it did in advanced nation. The British needed more than 1,500 years of civilized life to reach the free market system. The New Zealanders definitely did not take that long. And again, Chernyshevsky wrote, this acceleration consists in the fact that in a backward nation, thanks to the influence of the advanced nation, the development of certain social phenomenon leaps directly from the lower to the higher level, avoiding intermediate stages along the way. There is much more. Chernyshevsky theory differed from the Slavophile thinkers of the time. I clarified this, but this is what Bob said. Perhaps, Bob, I would say, but I know that we do not disagree at all on this, that the change of Marx that you see as perhaps not emphasized enough here compared, for example, to the bad preface of 1859, is something that already happened before. Like, it's not the discovery that Marx is making in particular in this period or after reading these particular things. Like, I see more the preface of 1859 and some other sentences that you can find here and there as the exception, and not as, you know, a clear line that Marx said in his historical materialism. So I hope that I was able to better clarify what you asked me. But I very much like what Bob told us about, he said, how he taught more than what he taught, how to think. This is extremely relevant for us. So I would say that it is useful to see in this Marx that Andy presented also in this intimate way, also with this doubt, also with the weakness of a human being who was so affected by life, as a person who, number one, is not worried about continuing the research. It is actually impossible for Marx to stop. And Bob told us he's into science, and then you turn the page and you find out that he's studying chemistry, and then he's learning about, and then he's asking statistics from the United States, and they send the statistic from Massachusetts. And Marx said, no, 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 I want them from California. The key is the change in California. Show me what is happening to railway. I mean, they couldn't follow all the things that he wanted, all these friends that he had around the world. But it is good to see that he's also asking many questions. So not only providing answers, but also asking questions. And I say that this is useful for us because, you know, perhaps one of the main contributions of Marx today is probably this one, is help us to ask the right question and to identify the main contradictions. I don't think that this is a very small point for us. Like, so using this Marx as identify the questions. Now, the entire debate about the forms of socialism, you know, according to Marx's ideas, Andy, I cannot enter into that now. It is impossible. We have 5 minutes left, and surely Michael would like to say something. But I must say that in this book, The Marx Revival, that I edited, it came out just 2 weeks before the other one. It is called Key Concept and New Interpretation, published by Cambridge University Press. I have a chapter on communism. It's a book with 22 chapters, many prestigious scholars of Marx. And in this chapter, I try to develop these things that you asked me. So I would say that the last years of Karl Marx is more focused on the analysis of capitalism, while in the Marx Revival, you see what you were asking, and also you see this direction that I want to take for, you know, contemporary use of Marx. And the final things, I also would like to end with something personal, like Andy did, but I would like to use what my colleague and friend Bob asked. So the last conversation, the last night between Marx and Engels, and by making a joke and, you know, ending with a light tone, I would like to ask to Andy, to Bob, to Michael, to all of us, do you think that they discuss about theory and the last book that they wrote, or perhaps Engels convinced Marx to discuss about the taste of the last glass of wine? With this question, I thank you very much for your attention.
Marcello, the applause is much louder than you can hear. There's all of us on mute. Zoom is a technology we as a species have brought together so that we can be together today. And I would like there to be questions, but I did not clear with you, Andy or Bob, if you could wait and maybe stay 10, 15 more minutes, just so that some people can, it's okay with you. And is it okay with you, Marcello?
I can stay 10 and 15 minutes, and in particular, if all the questions are directed to Andy and to Bob, of course.
They both did that thumbs up thing, so we're ready, but people, with your questions and comments, be brief in consideration of our time. So I will try to monitor and take 3 questions or comments at a time. Raise your hand on screen. Marnia, you are first. I need to go to the other screen. Fred, you are second, and Ben, you are third. So Marnia, you first.
Nice. Hi, thank you, Marcello. Thank you also to the discussants. I learned a lot. Marcello, I just started reading your book, so I haven't finished it, but just before I logged on, I skipped to the chapter on the Moor's last journey. My question is really, refers to what you think is one of the most important things that we should take away from focusing on Marx's late years, which is, his, interest in the countries of the South and, in the development. So my question is about the relationship between Marx's experience in Algeria and his work on colonial formations. In 1881, this was the year when the Code de l'Indigène, the Indigenous Peoples Code, was actually finalized, after the Senators Consultants of 1865, which for all practical purposes had dispossessed, Algerians of their land. So I haven't read all of the letters that Marx, wrote out of Algeria, but two things struck me. One is what you say is his discussion of communal property in Algeria, but there is nothing there that suggests also that there was side by side with it, individual property.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, and second, another thing that leapt out to me is that in some of the letters, he recounts what Fermé had told him about the inequities of the legal system, where an Algerian who would have stolen something, but he would be decapitated for that, and 5 or 6 other people had to be decapitated, to give an example. And another thing is the degree to which Marx shared with his Western contemporaries, especially the French, in this notion of this noble Algerian who, even though he may be barefoot and his clothing may be, actually being just rags, had this incredible,
Thank you, Carol.
prestance.
Okay, what's wrong?
So, yeah. So I just, and on a lighter note, I was wondering if there was some sort of a symbolic significance to Marx having shaved, his beard in Algiers. So what Andy said resonated with me.
Fred, you are next. Thank you, Marnia. Fred Murphy.
I'll pass.
Benjamin, you are next. Did he leave after raising his hand? I see he is not here. Okay. Until other people, Marcello, Bob, Andy, who would like to respond to Marnia's statement? Questions?
Well, I think this is directed to me, and I can do it very quickly, and we can end the meeting with everybody there. Unfortunately, the first question I could not understand, because when you were asking the question, Fred Murphy turned the microphone on and there was an overlapping, but I think I understood what you said, like the general things. And I can quickly say that when Marx was there physically in Algeria, he was completely unable to do any kind of work. He could barely read the newspaper. So Marx travels to Algeria is the only trip that he did outside Europe in his entire life. But as Bob and Andy told us, he was traveling a lot with this mind. And actually he was already in Algeria in 1877 when he studied Kowalewski, and when he enjoyed very much a lot of the things that Kowalewski wrote about the common property, as I mentioned before. And the idea of Marx is that the presence of French colons and the presence of bourgeois mode of production and lifestyle is actually destroying the communal force, the communitarian spirit of that society, that even though, once again, that is not at all the communism that Marx had in mind. I said Marx is not Herzen, Marx is not a Slavophile, Marx does not believe that the Obshchina is the society of the future. Marx is not thinking about that level of decentralization, because the rural commune in Russia or in Algiers is non-democratic, is based on patriarchy, and it is not related with the cosmopolitanism and with the level of production that is developed enough, okay? But Marx is supporting that in light of what I said by using Chernyshevsky. So better this, and this can skip capitalism instead of bringing this ideology of commodifying everything, things, land, and human relations. And it is for this reason that Marx, in these letters, unfortunately only 12 of the letters wrote in Algiers were kept. Many of them were destroyed for many reasons in the family, but he is always fighting against inequity. He's always making very bad comments against the case that you mentioned before, the decapitation, the racism, etc. And actually you find the same kind of statement about the strong opposition that Marx had to the British in Egypt in the same periods, actually a few months even after when Marx is back in Europe. So we have a clear case of anti-colonialism in politics, and also attention to what is happening in that society in theory.
Ben, who had a question, came back to the Zoom room. So Ben, you are up.
Thank you so much. Such an interesting conversation. Marx was famously combative. Did he ever fight with Engels? Did you ever, did he ever write about being upset about a fight or a conflict? I wonder, given our debates about orthodoxy, did he have anything to say about how people read his writings? Because we all debate about what's the best way to read it. But I'm just wondering if he ever discussed his fights or the conflicts. Did it ever upset him? I didn't ever read anything that sort of suggested he was upset by that. But anyway, I'm just wondering.
Maybe I could comment on this, if I may. If you hear me, I'm interested in Engels' relations to Marx, and I've read a lot of their correspondence. I want to read a lot more, and I'm sure Marcello's read more than I have. They worked together so closely, it seemed to me, in all sorts of ways. Some division of labor, lots of overlap in what they're thinking, suggestions from Engels about the economics and the politics and so on. On the whole, they seem to be very close. Engels was very hurt when Marx didn't say anything in reply when Engels' partner, long-term partner, died. He was hurt by that. And there might have been more words when they were in the pub than in the correspondence on that kind of issue. There are lots of minor issues that didn't cause combat. And one issue I think that does come up on the side and looking at historical materialism that I've tried to investigate a little bit is that it seems to me Engels was much more concerned about the development of consciousness of the workers, and in writing about the working class in England, he was impressed of how much they knew Shelley and other revolutionary radicals writers. And so I think there's a difference then. There's a lot of steps in between, but I think there's a difference in Marx being most interested in unions and associations and communication, bringing the workers together, and they don't have to change their thinking very much. While on the other hand, I think Engels saw and was interested in how people were thinking and how that would bring them to the revolutionary situation. And in reading Marcello's book, I have a feeling that Marx might have moved in that direction a little bit. Of course, both go together, of the importance of unions and the importance of thinking, but they're two very different aspects, and a lot of politicking would work in different ways, depending on how that analysis goes. I think they worked well together. I can't imagine they're having any great fight.
Thank you. Can we have time for one more question? There was Mary Boger, you had a question?
Mentioned that Engels almost broke from Marx over the question of him not responding to his partner's death and only asking for money in his condition. Marx was always leaning on Engels for that. But now that I'm here, I wanted to add about this thing about the questionnaire. The Communist Manifesto was, it was Engels who, Engels is really the first ethnographer. He wrote the conditions of the working class in England, and he actually lived in their homes and did that. And in the development of the Communist Manifesto, he wrote up a questionnaire that was circulated to the workers first in order for them to plan the writing of the Communist Manifesto. And he did the first draft, which was then given to Marx to revise. So, they were a partnership, but they had also different things that they contributed, but also affected each other. But I think Engels should be acknowledged as the first ethnographer. He actually did that kind of study. So that's all. I appreciate all three of you. It was marvelous. I just really, the work is important to do, and seeing the developmental, for me, I would just end with this one thing I'd like to say. What we see is the development of the individual in time and place. It's I really got sick and tired of this, the young Marx and the old Marx, and separating it. It's a process of people learning and understanding and studying in their world and growing and growing and growing. It's process, just like he had to keep revising Capital because development of capitalism is occurring. So it's really about this, and you've really done a beautiful thing by talking the way and writing about it the way you're doing. And hopefully in our minds, we can start to think differently about process and development and growth and the individual and all of that. So I really appreciate that aspect of what was done today, with especially having the three of you combined. So thank you very much.
Marcello, Andy, Bob, it's now coming on 3:15. This has been what a fitting end to our year of incredible growth. The countervailing tendency of the pandemic, when many of us couldn't work, is many people from around the world have found what we're trying to do here in our little homes or whatever in New York. And we're discovering more and more people want to get together for these kinds of discussions. And the three of you have just really made a great close to this year. And I want to let people know we have ongoing reading groups of Andy's book right now. And when we finish Andy's book, which will be 6 weeks from now, we're going right into Marcello's book. So if you want to take part, I'm not a salesperson, but I am pushing these books. These people put their heart and souls into these books, and they are transformative, much like the work of Marx, Engels, and many other in the tradition are. And you can come together with us in other times. We are going to have other events with all of the three people here today and many others. There will be a series discussion on Engels sometime in April and more. Beyond that, Marcello, you can have the last word before we all head to the end of 2020, and we will see all of us again after this. Marcello.
Thanks. I just sent 2 links, one with the presentation of my next book that will be published the 3rd week of January, and is an anthology on Marx alienation, will be published by Palgrave Macmillan. And I shared also a short article about Marx and Engels, but what Bob said was very brilliant. I just wanted to express my sincere gratitude to Andy and to Bob for what they said. I learned a lot from them, and I also will be here with many of you and with more comrades for the presentation of Bob. I got the book of Andy. I will read it very quickly. And Michael, of course, this was only possible thanks to your spirit, your organization, your passion. So thanks to you and to all the comrades who were with us today.
I thank everyone who came. This is another great beginning for our work to get this work going. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Bob. Great to meet you, Bob. Great seeing you again, Andy. Goodbye, everyone, and see you next year.
Yeah. Happy New Year.
Bye-bye to everybody. Bye, Andy.
Ciao. Yeah.
Ciao. Okay.
Some of us don't want to leave. Okay, bye-bye.